Thanks everybody for joining. Sorry we're getting started a little late, a technical issue on my side. Here are the housekeeping rules. As you noted when we joined the Zoom, we are asking you to respect the code of conduct. There's also simultaneously interpretation available in English, French, and Spanish. There are also closed captions available in English. You should be able to set those options in your Zoom panel. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphone and on mute, and please use the chat for any questions or raise your hand if you need to make an intervention in audio. If you can, please format your questions with your first name and country, for example, Ted, Portugal. And feel free to type your questions in French or Spanish. Those will be translated and sent to the chair. As you can hear from the thing just a moment ago, the session is being recorded, and a link for future viewing will be shared after the call. Next slide, please. Here's a demonstration of where you find the live transcription and the closed captioning. Next slide, please. So we've just gone through the introduction. We'll just touch briefly on the working group charter constraints and some additional housekeeping, and then we'll go to comments and questions. Next slide, please. As folks know, the Governance Reform Working Group was chartered with a specific remit, and there were some limitations set out in it. And I want to remind you that as a result, the report and the activities were somewhat constrained, and those constraints included proposals that would require relocation or dissolution of the Internet Society it is currently incorporated in the United States, or consider proposals that would breach or negate current legal relationships and agreements between the Internet Society and ICANN, or between the Internet Society and the Public Interest Registry. Primarily for the elections related one, we also note that it could not include proposals to reduce the stakeholder community's ability to choose candidates to serve on the Board of Trustees. Since that's not really the topic of today's consultation, perhaps not as important today. Next slide, please. Okay, the floor is now open. George, do you want to kick us off with just a moment or two of reflections as one of the chairs?
Yes, thank you, Ted. Hans-Peter Dettler and I were co-chairs of the final 6 months of the process, and there was a great deal of interest in the working group for a variety of reasons. We had about 100 and some people altogether posting, maybe little less than 100. There were thousands of posts, and the opinions varied all over the map. The governance part, the part that we're going to be talking about today, not having to do with diversity of board and elections, was an interesting one. And at the beginning of the process, this process started certainly at the end of a period in which ISOC had tried to negotiate a sale of PIR, you may recall, in 2019, 2020. And at that point, there was a great concern from the membership and from others about whether this was an appropriate thing to do, and some of the dissatisfaction that was implicit in the discussion came from that. Michael Godwin, who was one of the original co-chairs, suggested that this was not a governance issue, really. This was an issue of relationships between the membership and the society, but it could be posted as a governance issue to see how far we got with it. So in the report, Hans-Peter and I characterized this process as a bit of an alienation of the membership, primarily the chapter and the individual members, and the staff. And we worked to try to understand this, but it was more an issue of going through complaints and concerns rather than receiving any suggestions for a how should I say, a rapprochement between the two. Now the question is, how big is this? Big at all? Is this a matter of trust? Is this a matter of governance? We don't know, but we'd like to hear the feelings of the assembled group here. If you haven't read the report, it should be available. It's been distributed publicly to all members of the working group, and I hope if you have some reflections on the report, the nature of the report also. Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I fully agree with George's summary. I just wanted to amplify on it a little bit. One of the reasons that there was frustration with the decision taken by the board, which in the end didn't get put into place, was that the board was not able to disclose certain elements because the board had entered into a non-disclosure agreement with the proposer of the buy, with people that had proposed to buy PIR. Now, it seems to me, we all know that the board members have fiduciary duties, so they're constrained. And in this circumstance, it appears that they thought that it was necessary to agree to this non-disclosure because that was in the best interest of the Internet Society. So I'm wondering whether it would help in terms of transparency. It may not help in terms of making financial deals, but in terms of transparency and increasing trust, which, as George pointed out, was one of the issues that came up, would be to actually add a transparency requirement in the board. If I'm never going to be a member of the ISOC board, probably, or any other board. If I had been, I would have said, no, we can't do that. And if they said we were violating a fiduciary duty, then I would have just resigned. And what I mean is I would not have agreed to something that could not be transparent. Now, as I recall, ISOC does have, ICANN does have some sort of transparency requirement written into its bylaws. I'm not sure how binding that is or whatever, but I think maybe that's something that could be thought about. Should ISOC add some sort of strong transparency requirement in its bylaws, which would then oblige the board members not to enter into those sort of non-disclosure agreements, with the understanding, of course, that that's limiting what the board could do, because it means that it couldn't envisage the kind of deal that was envisaged here. So that's kind of something that I'm offering to think through. Thanks.
Stephen Farrell?
Just a question of preference. Mine is a slightly different topic. Do you want to pursue the previous topic first, and then come back to me? If you do, that's fine.
I think the primary question for the previous topic is obviously the board holds most of its meetings in open session. It records them and makes them available, puts them on YouTube. All of the parts of the functioning of the board that can be open are pretty much open now when it's acting formally as a board. So there are discussions that occur in executive session, and those are usually taken into executive session on advice of counsel. So our chief counsel lets us know if a particular issue might require executive session. And I don't think that we can actually exercise the duties of the board and never have executive session. It's certainly the case that we would have to see what the proposal was for a transparency clause to know whether it's something that would both allow us to meet the transparency clause and meet the fiduciary duties which are required of a 501c3 board under the law in which it's incorporated. And I'll remind you that it's out of the remit of this group to consider reincorporating somewhere else. So if there's a specific proposal, we can certainly take that to our chief counsel and discuss it with her. But as it is now, I think the board has taken on, and especially since Gonzalo pushed the board to begin pushing things onto YouTube, et cetera, the idea that the community would like us to be as transparent as is possible. The real question is there a difference of opinion on what's possible? Stephen?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so again, it's slightly related, but a bit different topic. I tend to agree that the board agreeing a kind of confidentiality mechanism in this PIR proposed sale was an error. I think the board made a mistake in agreeing that. But aside from that, I think the board should try and establish mechanisms for consultation for big changes, and also try and define what big changes means. I'd be entirely happy if the board figure out how to parameterize those things. I'd be entirely happy if the board experiment with ways of consulting. But I do think that in the case of something as significant as, for example, the proposed PIR sale, that should not have been done, personally, I don't think, without some kind of broad consultation, even if that's a barrier to cutting a deal, which it would have been. So my basic comment is I would like the board, if they were willing, to try and figure out what's a reasonable definition of big change, and experiment with ways of consulting in the face of any such big change in the future.
Could I ask you to suggest what such an experiment might be?
It could be surveys, it could be establishing a mailing list, it could be, perhaps you could imagine that this governance working group was an experiment. So, you know, perhaps the mechanism of setting up a mailing list and having somebody lead a discussion is a way of consulting. Again, surveys, all the usual kind of things. I understand that there are difficulties in you know, the membership question and so on, but I think it should be an area where experimentation may help.
Okay, thank you. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask your question in Spanish or French, you're welcome to type that into the chat, and it will be translated for the group. The floor is open. Are there any other comments? I see George's hand up. Just a quick clarification. I think I did say earlier, put your hand up. I meant in the tool, there are 4 different screens of participants. So it's not necessarily the case that you're on the screen that we can see, or that any other participant sees at this particular moment. So if you do have a comment you'd like to make, please raise your hand in the Zoom tool or type it into the chat. My apologies for that lack of clarity before. George?
Thanks, Ted. Well, I wanted to raise a particular aspect that had been discussed in the report and in the discussions that had occurred, and ask, when we look at established methods of communication now between the members and the board, we have the chapter's advisory committee. And there's a process for raising an issue to the chapter's advisory committee, and there's a process for the committee to bring it to the board. It seems to me somewhat slow and ponderous. Maybe it isn't to you, but is this an effective mechanism? Because there were opinions that were in several different directions here. Some thought it was useless. Others thought, well, it should be improved. There should be more openness in the CHAC. Are there opinions on that? I just raised that as a possible issue for discussion.
Any thoughts from the room? So there's a second question that's been asked in the chat by Sarita. which is how do you ensure the representation from marginalized sections of society, like persons with disabilities, in boards and chapters? So in consultation, we usually send consultations out to the whole society. And obviously there are people with disabilities both in a specific special interest group and across the society. So they would normally be included. Beyond that, I'm not sure what sections of society you might have in mind. And if you'd like to take the floor and expand, we'd be happy to listen. Mohammed, would you like to respond or clarify?
Yes, Ted. One part of the question was with regards to persons with disabilities and how the chapters and boards ensure the part of communication. So since we are talking about communication and consultation, my suggestion there would be to send the message across in different formats. For instance, if the message is being sent in an English language, translation of different languages would help. Also, sign language interpretation of different videos would also help, as well as description of any images that may come in the spreading of the messages would certainly be helpful for people with disabilities. So these are just some of the suggestions to start with. Of course, there is a complete science of making your messages and communications and social media platforms accessible for people with disabilities. The chapters and the Internet Society communication team can also benefit from those tips and documents that are already available and produced by different organizations. This is one thing that I wanted to say. Of course, if there are other marginalized groups in the societies other than the people with disabilities, and certainly there would be other advices and strategies to include input from those groups, and I would welcome those as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Peter.
Yes, just my thought on the Chapter Advisory Council. Many years ago, 25 years ago, most of the communication between members and staff and the board happened alongside IETF meetings, ICANN meetings. You just ran into somebody, grabbed him, took him away, and talked to him as long as you liked. Over the years, this became less and less possible. So around, must be now 10 years, 11 years, I'm not sure. John might have a better collection about, John Moore might have a better collection, and he's on a call. We sat down in Washington and decided something has to be changed, and had a raw sketch of the Chapter Advisory Council. And it was clear thought as a way to channel messages and communications in both directions. To my dismay, now I see that this channel has been, I would say, very much formalized, and it's not utilized anymore for free flow of communication. It's just for, yeah, let's say, very big or heavy topics. So I think, or I believe, or I feel there is really a lack of communication, a free flow of information between staff, board, and membership of all kinds. We have a lot of consultations, but below the official consultations about the program, about whatever, there is not enough communication flowing in both directions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. After John, I will read some reflections from the chat that have not been read aloud. But John, you're next.
So I just want to reiterate what Hans-Peter said. One of the things I've had long experience with activist organizations, And one of the strengths of ISOC can be the fact it has this international organization, has individual chapters that are doing things. But it's better just question of how much more integration can be done. And I think the Chapter Advisory Council has begun it, but the communications are not as two-way and not as robust. And I guess maybe a mechanism to allow for groups to make presentations to the Chapter's Advisory Council on important issues. Anyway, I just wanted to support, but I do think this is an important part of ISOC that needs to be continued to be addressed. So I welcome it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Just reflecting some things from that chat before we go on to Jordi. The report was circulated to the mailing list with the subject line for final report of GRWG attached community meeting information. That was in response to a number of people who asked how they got a copy of the report. Luis noted that the proceedings of the Chapter Advisory Council are open to any ISOC member, and a local chapter can provide the latest information on their activities in the chat. Stephen noted that he doesn't have a local chapter, but that's a different story. Andrew provided the mechanism for joining the Governance Reform Working Group if you're not already a member. And Siddharth Bami asked the question, the topic was structured on consultations, I believe. Do these consultations pertain to board meetings, or outward consultations pertain to internet working and policies in general? And given ISOC is a 501c3, how can these be done with corporates? In general, the topic of this is different mechanisms or structures for consultation. And I think the topic that was just raised by Hans-Peter and John correctly concludes that this does include how to make sure that two-way communication is robust both between the board and the community and among different parts of the community. Flavio notes the CHUC is not being used to really consult the chapters on more strategic issues or to discuss policy issues. Meetings are very sparse and handle mostly administrative issues. It could be much more effective. It would also be useful to see how well the CHUC interacts with the Board of Trustees. Sagarika says accessible format of websites and encourage the web developers to develop pages with more access-friendly contents was one way of inclusion. I think this refers back to the previous topic that Mohammed replied to. Luis noted to Flavio that the CHAC, as any ISOC body, provides regular reports to the Board of Trustees. Sagarika says we are supposed to push policymakers to have policy with persons with disability-friendly web pages. Andrew provided yet a different method for connecting to the list. Flavio asked Luis, could these regular reports from the CHAC to the Board of Trustees be conveyed to the chapters? And Luis noted the reports are part of the open session to the Board of Trustees and therefore are available if you go to the and review the Board of Trustees meeting materials. Jordi, I think you're next. And John, I still see your hand open up, but was that from before? Okay, Jordi?
Okay, thank you very much. I want to share my opinion as member of the Chapter Advisory Council. I joined the council last year and also a member during this year. My opinion is that chapters do not see the Advisory Council as a communication channel. This is, again, my opinion. All what I'm saying, it's my own opinion during this last year and this month. And most of the tasks in the council are, let's say, administrative tasks. I'm not saying that those are not useful and should not be done, but most of the 60 minutes of the meeting goes dedicated to some administrative task. Again, this should be done, but in my opinion, the most important point is that chapters do not see the Advisory Council as the proper communication channel. And I think this is a topic or issue we should address. Also, the way the representatives for the Chapter Advisory Council are elected is, in my opinion, does not facilitate the operation. For instance, every year there are elections, and it may happen that from one year to the next year, all the members are completely new. So there is no continuity. Also, the representatives, and again, it's my opinion, should do more effort to participate in all the meetings, or we should think to enlarge the size of the advisory council so that we have a minimum number of participants. And related with this, perhaps, and this is an idea, the renewal of the members should be every year, but perhaps not all the members, so that there is a continuity, because this is my own experience. When I joined the advisory council, basically I spent the full year following and trying to understand what were the topics, and I saw that, well, I did not expect this should work as it is working. So, by chance, I'm again this year in the advisory council, but I could not be there. So basically, I can stay there for 2 years, and basically I cannot really contribute. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. It sounded like, as a couple of concrete statements, you felt that the Chapter Advisory Council might need to work on some mechanisms of continuity, and that you would like to see the Chapter Advisory Council perhaps have separate meetings for administrative issues, or at least separate out the topics for administrative and other issues. And I think we can certainly reflect those back to the Chapter Advisory Council, but to some degree that's only one of the topics here. And so if folks want to consider whether those would be issues they'd like to raise for other parts of the society, that would be a useful thing. There were a couple of comments in the chat. Stephen asked if there was a link to the above reports. Again, they're part of the mailing list. You should be able to get it from there. Kevin provided a link to a sample CHAC Steering Committee report to the ISOC board. Flavia replied to Lise, I was referring to very sparse meetings of the CHAC with the chapters, where they could really get the position of the chapters on relevant issues. Luis said, should the CHAC reform its structure to act as a better communication channel, it was unable to provide such communication. And went on to ask Flavio, we should ask the CHAP, we can get just a general report.
This is very disappointing.
Are there any other comments from the floor? George, you're not muted. Did you have an intervention?
Well, I'm thinking, in the absence of comments from the floor, I was musing the following, that if the chapters feel that they're not getting good communication to the board through the CHAC, how do they get communication with the board? Is it one way, two way? Is it sufficient? If it's lacking, how is it lacking? And what does it accomplish or not accomplish? I don't know if any chapter chairs or board members want to comment on that, but I think that's the heart of the issue. CHAC is an intermediary meant to help solve the issue. It doesn't seem to solve it totally. So what's left?
A couple of Questions have come in. One from Stanley Gabriel. J'habite en Haïti. Comment puis-je devenir un membre? Basically, if you would translate this for Stanley, you would find a local chapter to become a member. You could become a member of as an individual member, or possibly if you meant the chapter advisory council and become a member of that, there's an election process for that.
Well,
Okay, there's a comment from Sarita. In order to make its board truly inclusive, meaningful participation of persons with disabilities and sexual and gender minorities must be ensured. That was actually the topic of the previous consultation, and I encourage you to review the minutes or the recordings for that. I believe you're actually the first person to recommend sexual and gender minorities, but this topic has been discussed, and I encourage you to review that discussion and send further comments if need be. Stephen?
Hi, yeah, just having had a look at a few of one of those reports that was mentioned about chapter reports and to the Board of Trustees, just at a quick look, that looks like a totally inadequate method of communication. It's like a cookie cutter status slide. That's all I saw. Maybe there's other reporting. It seems very unidirectional, and in contrast to what I know the IETF and IIB interactions with the Board of Trustees are like, it seems pretty sparse and not particularly useful. So again, I would hope the Board of Trustees will try and work with whoever it is represents people in chapters to do something about improving that. I don't particularly mind how you improve it.
Thank you. Andrew notes in chat, I wonder whether the discussion about interaction between chapters and the board needs a statement about what the goal of interacting with the board is. I'm not sure what is wanted from the board, and I wonder whether the issue has to do with what people think the board is for. Richard.
Yeah, well, Andrew, I'm sure you know that the CHAC actually agreed advice regarding the proposed sale of PIR. And what that basically said is, well, first, it shouldn't go forward, at least not without more information. And second, the chapters should have been consulted and there should have been greater transparency. So what the chapters wanted in that particular case is very clear. And I believe that that's just one example of a generic wish for greater transparency, which I mentioned, but Ted has told us that greater transparency is not possible. So that's the end of the story. If that's what you say, that's what you say. But what the chapters are asking for, I think, is abundantly clear.
Just to clarify, what I actually said wasn't that greater transparency wasn't possible, but that we'd have to see a proposal for what the transparency was to make sure that we could deliver the fiduciary duties required of us in addition to the transparency. And that means talking to council about what transparency is wanted. In some cases, it's very clear we cannot, and some of the executive sessions that the board holds are very clearly on the advice of council that we cannot make those available to others. There are some others, for example, some of the sessions with PIR, where a fiduciary duty is to ensure that PIR, which is in a competitive industry, is not revealing information to the public that it is not ready to reveal to the public. So there are conditions under which the board occasionally must operate that do require that it meet without full transparency and report instead in summary. And I think that's definitely going to continue to be the case. The question is really, are there parts of the transparency that we're trying to accomplish where we can increase it without hindering those fiduciary duties? And Richard, your hand is still up. Is that from before, or did you have a second intervention? Or rather,
no, I just wanted to come back quickly to clarify. I'm sorry I misunderstood what you said in the beginning. Yes, obviously there are things. For just one obvious example is personnel matters. Obviously, some things are not going to be totally transparent. But you say, what's the proposal for transparency? Well, we're not the lawyers, as you correctly said. That's a matter for the lawyers. So what I'm saying is that I believe the chapters want greater transparency, and I don't think it's fair to go back to put the ball back on us and say, well, what exactly do you want? It's up to you to come up and say, look, this is what can be achieved. And I come back and say, well, and what if you put a transparency requirement in the bylaws? Would that make a difference or not? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but it's something to explore. And it's not something that you should ask us to come up with a legally binding proposal. And I saw Andrew's post on the chat to the effect that ICANN has lots of closed meetings. Yes, of course they do. And as you say, some things are always going to be closed. That's not the point. The point is, could it be more open? And if so, what needs to be done? And does it need a change in the bylaws? I don't know, but I think that's something that the board and their legal advisors should look into. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe that the core of your question is one we can certainly continue to consider. I will say that the issue which started this discussion many moons ago around PIR, and I was not on the board at the time, but my understanding of the fiduciary duty that they had was one where the commercial aspects of it did require confidentiality, and that attempting to do it without that confidentiality would have meant that they might have failed their fiduciary duty, that if they're offered an ability to serve the foundation and they decline it in order to accomplish some other goal, that they may not meet their fiduciary duty. But again, I wasn't on the board at the time, so I can't really comment on the details. In the meantime, there are a number of things that have come in chat, so I will try and catch us up there. From Winthrop U, there are and should be other channels aside from Chapter Advisory Committee. There used to be time when we could discuss various ISOC matters with the ISOC regional officers/staff, but now it seems that ISOC has become excessively centralized, and ISOC regional role seems to now be issuing instructions from ISOC Central to the chapters, a one-way street. Charles Donaldson Vieira says, I'm a grassroots internet governance enthusiast with strict adherence to the use of internet to document and do human rights advocacy from the grassroots community of Karamoja in Uganda. We offer advocacy of encryption and digital security support to embattle grassroots human rights defenders at risk. How can my participation add up to the board? Ashirawad says, for SIG 2 is the same as chapters. Stephen Farrell says, Andrew, for what it's worth, I thought there was a pretty clear disconnect back during the PIR sales saga. Flavio says, Andrew, could you revert the question, should the board be interested in hearing what the chapters or their leaders think about relevant issues? Gary Campbell says, at TED, I agree. Stephen says, proposal with regard to transparency, don't sign any NDAs as the Board of Trustees. Luis says, at Asherwad, SIGs are largely similar to chapters, however, there is no CHAC exclusively equivalent to SIGs, if this answers your question. Andrew, Flavio, sure, also of interest, but what does one want the effect of that interaction between chapters and the board supposed to be? Sorry, unfortunately changed syntax part of the way through. Venny says, by the way, on the subject of chapters, we just received today a request to sign a new letter of agreement with ISOC, where the purpose of the chapter is defined as, the purpose of the chapter shall be to support the Internet Society's vision, mission, and operating principles in the territory. I might have missed the discussion on that subject. Was there one, and could we look into some transcripts? Notes. Siva Subramanian says, what the board could do is to set up a bulletin board inside the boardroom visible to senior staff and trustees, wherein chapters could pin up issues, which will both ensure that the chapter issues reach the board and at the same time make the Board of Trustees feel connected to what is felt or is happening on the ground. Venny notes that the we in the phrase above was ISOC Bulgaria. Stephen Farrell says, I think that interpretation of the fiduciary duty of the board at that time is something that could be debated. There are reasonable arguments both ways. Siva Subramanian says it could be a plain board or a tabbed board, including a tab for other issues, miscellaneous issues, or suggestions, a wish list, or anything otherwise not grouped or foreseen. Asherwad says, at Lewis, we do have elected AMS officer and CHAC representatives, but the roles seem to be very limited. And Benny says, by the way, Ted, such a quick reading is probably causing the interpreters to lose some hair. I apologize. I apologize for any hair lost. Andrew says to Venny, the changes to the chapter engagement letter was, as I understand it, discussed pretty extensively prior to the changes to it that took effect in 2018. Winthrop U +1's Venny, and Flavio says, One of the effects of the interaction between chapters and the board should be that the chapters feel they are being heard as part of ISOC, help shape the main programs and positions. Current interaction is very weak. At TED, can you please elaborate how a nonprofit PIR can operate in a competitive market? Is it supposed to maximize profit, or is it supposed to best serve the interest of its constituency? Venny says, Andrew, this letter is replacing the one from 2018, so not sure there are any differences. Haven't had the chance to compare, and there is no note, which tells us that the chapters are. Stephen says, regarding fiduciary duty and the PIR sale, I agree. In my view, transparency is also a fiduciary duty in ISOC. Okay, so there was a lot in that, and I'm not going to try and tackle each of them, but first I'm going to just point out the meta issue. A lot of what we've been talking about here is a scaling problem. How do we get a society of 86,000 people to interact in a way so that when issues are brought forward, we understand how important they are to different members of the society and how they fit into a larger picture? And the comments that were made about a bulletin board, obviously there are online bulletin boards which use ranking and voting algorithms to determine how important something is. Reddit is one such. And the upvotes and downvotes in that help determine what the vast mass of the society or a particular subreddit are interested in. And we could implement something that had that kind of characteristic. But I'll warn you that there are obvious and severe side effects to that. One is the ability to downvote something can mean that people with minority opinions are never heard, because the majority opinions make sure that those fall below the threshold for ever being at the top of the pile or within view of the common part of the community. The typical way that's resolved in situations like that is to fork into separate communities. And so if you have different communities and something is very, very important to one particular SIG community, for example, it's separated out from the concerns of, let's say, chapters who are in the midst of doing community networking. That turns it from one kind of scaling problem into another kind of scaling problem. And I think we have to be very careful in understanding, to go back to a point Andrew made some time ago, what is it we're attempting to do with this communication? And I think the biggest answer here goes back to the mission. We're trying to find the points at which the society as a whole wants to deliver its mission across the different parts of the society. Each chapter is independent, both of itself and of ISOC, but we all ascribe to the same mission, as does the OMAC and as does the work of the IETF. We're all trying to make the internet for everyone. We're all trying to make it stronger, more successful, and more extensive. And I think we have to try and figure out what it is about our communication that bubbles up to the top, those things which actually help us deliver the mission. Because there certainly are administrative issues or other things which are critically important to a small group of people for some period of time in accomplishing their work to deliver that mission, but possibly don't need that horizontal scaling property. And I think part of what we're struggling with, certainly as a board, I could spend every single moment of my time talking to members of the society. Because there are 86,000 of them, I would never be done. And I would never know, really, how well I was doing at capturing the sense of the society, but because, simply having a 5-minute, much less an extensive conversation with every member of the society would be impossible. So we have to work on what the scaling properties of this community is. And the scaling that we've used in the past has historically been by creating organizations like the Chapter Advisory Committee, or OMAC, which can spend time with subgroups of the society to bring their issues forward or to take issues across the society. Those may not be the right scaling properties anymore. And it's certainly the case that having these open forums is useful, but it also has a real scaling problem. There's something under 100 people on this one, taking into account the one we'll have later, probably less than 250 in all told. And that's a small subset of the society. It's larger than the ones we normally get, and that's useful, but it also is probably not enough. So part of what we're looking for, to kind of go back to a point earlier, is what is it we're trying to do with these communications so that we can make sure that when we try and create these new structures, that they scale in the appropriate directions? Are they meant to be across the society so that board members participate just as any other member would, and there are ways for the different elements of society to talk to each other? Are they meant to help the board make decisions? Are they meant to help different parts of the society cooperate on specific projects or specific policy questions? And understanding that set of issues a little bit better may help us make sure that the structures that we create actually serve both the society and the mission a little bit better. And Mohammed, I see your hand.
Yes, thank you, Ted. This is a very critical question, that how do the board or one as a board member or as a board collectively listens to every member of the society. And as Ted said, that it is not possible for the board to listen to each and every 86,000 of the members of the Internet Society. They are all important for us, but practically and humanly it's not possible. So there have to be structures, and I believe that we need to strengthen as well as find structures so that they help the board determine that the ways they adopt to consult communities reflect the wishes and the inputs of as many members as possible. For now, I see as a Internet Society Board of Trustees, 3 communities giving input to the board separately, but I don't see a single platform for each of these communities. Board is, of course, one where it receives input from all three communities, but each of them send input to the board separately. For chapters, there is JAC. For organizations, there is OMAC, and then there is the IETF processes. Then I also see problems within these structures. Chapters and individual members feel that CHAC is not adequately representing their concerns at the board. But at the same time, during my last 1 year experience at the board, I feel that OMAC is also lacking in reflecting the issues of the organizations. At the roundtable, there have been very less participation from the organization members. And also, due to the many reasons, the chapter representatives and the chapters, their participation at the CHAC meetings have been, and their interests have been very low. So we need to improve these structures and find a way to send our input. And when I say our, I mean the community input to the board that reflects the concerns of the community. This is one question. I certainly know that I don't give any answers. I raise more questions, but these questions are very important as we try to find ways to the issues that we face today.
Thank you, Mohammed. Once again, there's a good amount of back and forth in the chat. I'm going to try and look through it at the moment and look and see if there are any interventions which are to the group as a whole, and basically set aside those which are between different participants. Flavio says, consulting with 80,000 members may be very complex, but a large part of those members are also chapter or SIG members. Interacting with chapters and SIGs should be much easier. I think one of the questions that was just raised is the question of whether that has been appropriate when it's going through the Chapter Advisory Council, or whether it needs to go directly to SIGs and chapters rather than through the Chapter Advisory Council. Chapters and SIGs are supposed to represent the views of their member, and I don't think anybody questions that. It's just whether that whether that communications channel is wide enough. Stephen Farrell reiterates what he said at the start: do experiments on how to consult. Again, we welcome any thoughts on what those experiments should be. Siva Subramanian says, it need not be a 70mm screen of issues visible to all chapters, but visible to trustees and senior staff. One who posts issues may not see what others have. I think this goes back to his point earlier about the idea of a bulletin board. Andrew, Louise says, ISOC has always had the same communication structure as many other societies such as IEEE or ACM. Benny asks, how many board trustees are on the call? I actually haven't counted. How many were on the previous one? Let's see if they are showing interest, and this could be giving some ideas of the lack of participation is across the organization, including the Board of Trustees, or just among members. Fred and Andrew are talking, and Benny are talking. Andrew. Okay, so I've tried to capture what's in the there that didn't seem to be crosstalk between specific individuals. And I think one of the biggest questions that we will continue to look for guidance from the community on is, if we are going to experiment with this, I think it'd be most successful to have experiments that didn't require changes in structures right away. So it may be that those experiments would guide us at some future point to changing structures. But I think what would be very valuable for us is if you have ideas on what specific experiments we could run for different types of consultations, it would be useful. And what the goal is it communication with the board, is it communication with different parts of the society, and how we would measure success there. Because I think it's quite useful for us to experiment with different things. I believe these public forums have been put in abeyance for a few years, and this is the first time this board has had a chance to use it and get an experience of how it can help. But other ideas of what kinds of experiments to run would be very, very useful, and I encourage you to send those to the board if you can. Andrew answers the question on how many trustees are on this call. According to my count, there are 8 current or incoming trustees in this call. Just as a reminder, we are having 2 different ones of these in order to account for different time zones. So it may be that some trustees could only make the later of these consultations. That certainly would reflect what happened in the first pair. So as we're kind of coming on to the top of the hour, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I want to thank the folks who were involved in the Government's Reform Working Group for spending their time and effort and thinking through these questions. And I want to remind everybody that this is going to be an ongoing process. We'll probably think through how to do different experiments here, or think through how to make changes that improve the communications among the different parts of the society, especially to the board. And we hope that as we go through the rest of that process, you continue to let us know how different parts of it are working for the different aspects that we're attempting to improve. And we'll do our best to make sure that if we do make changes or do introduce new mechanisms, we're clear with what we're hoping to achieve, so that you can help us measure whether or not we actually are achieving it. Thanks again to everybody, and let me wish you the best with the rest of your day or evening.